A storm is coming, one that could change everything for a lone mountaineer. Deep in the Appalachian wilderness, his ingenuity will soon be tested in ways he never imagined. But when the bitter cold strikes, and his cabin becomes his only refuge, will his creation withstand the force of nature? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're drawn to stories of survival and rugged frontier life, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode is even more incredible than today's. It was the winter that broke the mountain. The kind of cold that would make the heart itself freeze if left outside for too long. The snow, relentless and unforgiving, had already begun to bury the forests under a thick blanket, its icy fingers creeping through every crack in the wooden cabins of the Appalachian highlands. Jonathan Calloway had spent many winters in the mountains, each one colder than the last, but this year was different. This was a cold that pierced through even the thickest firs and forced men to reckon with the raw power of the wilderness. The wind howled outside his cabin, its voice sharp and cruel. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the stone walls. The heat was barely enough to warm his bones, but it was all he had. He had built the cabin himself, meticulously stacking logs with care, but no amount of wood could prepare him for the bite of a mountain winter like this. Jonathan was a stocky man, his beard thick and wild, a testament to his years living alone in the wilderness. His face, tanned from the sun and weathered by years of hardship, now wore an expression of quiet determination. His brown shirt, worn at the collar from years of use, was stained with soot and sweat from tending the fire. His trousers, made of sturdy leather, clung to his legs, offering little protection against the ever-deepening cold that seeped into the room like a shadow. Outside, the blizzard intensified. It was no longer just snow, it was a force, as though the very mountain itself had risen to challenge him. Jonathan had long since given up on expecting anything but the worst from these mountains, but the ferocity of this storm felt different. This wasn't just a harsh winter. This was nature telling him it would not be tamed. A knock at the door startled him. It was quick, one sharp rap, and then nothing. He stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. In the dead of winter, it was unusual for anyone to be this far out in the wild, especially with the storm raging outside. Cautiously, he set his axe down beside the fire and approached the door, gripping the handle with a firm hand. Whoever was on the other side wouldn't be coming for a friendly visit. Jonathan opened the door slowly, just enough to peer outside, and there, standing on his doorstep, was a stranger. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, covered head to toe in snow, with eyes as sharp as the frost hanging in the air. His clothes, though weathered, seemed well made, likely from furs and sturdy fabrics, like something a fellow mountaineer might wear. But what struck Jonathan most was the man's expression. It was one of exhaustion mixed with fear, deep, guttural fear. "You got a fire?" the stranger asked, his voice strained, barely rising above the howling wind. Jonathan nodded. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to allow the man entry. As he walked in, Jonathan took in the man's appearance. He was younger than Jonathan had expected, with a thick, unkempt beard, wild eyes, and rough hands that spoke of a life spent in the mountains. His clothes were soaked, and his breath came in short, labored gasps. The stranger immediately moved to the fire, his hands outstretched to catch the warmth. Jonathan, not one to waste words in such circumstances, silently closed the door behind him and moved to fetch a blanket from the shelf. "Storm's worse than I thought," Jonathan muttered, more to himself than to the stranger, but the man heard it. He turned, his eyes locking with Jonathan's. "It's not the storm," the man replied, his voice low. "It's the bears." Jonathan's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" The stranger, after a moment's pause, exhaled deeply. "They've been getting bolder. The last few weeks they've been coming closer, testing the cabins, breaking down doors. I barely got away." Jonathan stared at the man, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "Bears? At this time of year?" The man nodded. "They're hungry, and they've learned how to break in. I don't think any of us are safe anymore." Jonathan's heart began to race. The Appalachian wilderness was full of dangers, but bears weren't usually this much of a threat in winter. Still, he knew better than to ignore warnings like this. The mountain was an unpredictable beast, and if the bears were testing their cabins, it meant trouble. He glanced around his own cabin, his eyes drifting over the stone walls, the sturdy wooden beams above, the carefully crafted hearth where the fire burned brightly. He'd built this place himself, with sweat and skill. It was his refuge from the wilderness. But now, for the first time, he wondered if it would be enough. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth providing only a temporary comfort against the icy winds howling outside. Jonathan moved closer to the stranger, who was now seated on the edge of the wooden bench, his hands still held out towards the flames. His face was drawn tight, his expression distant as though he were replaying the events that had brought him here. "You're saying the bears are learning to break in?" Jonathan asked, the disbelief in his voice lingering like the scent of the smoke curling up to the rafters. The stranger nodded, his eyes dark with fear. "I've seen it with my own eyes. The last few weeks, I've come across cabins, torn apart doors, ripped off their hinges, walls splintered, entire food stores raided. These weren't ordinary attacks. Bears are smarter than we think." His voice dropped, as though he feared the mountains themselves might hear him. Jonathan's mind raced. His own cabin, while sturdy, was far from invincible. Sure, it had the stone fireplace, the thick wooden walls, but were they enough to ward off a bear? Could he face down a creature that had learned to systematically tear apart his defenses? "Did you get a good look at them? Any signs of something different?" Jonathan asked, his voice edged with caution. The stranger's eyes flickered, his expression growing more troubled. "They're bigger, stronger, and they've been coming in groups. I don't know what's happening, but it's not like before. These animals are learning, adapting. It's only a matter of time before they come for us all." Jonathan stood silently for a moment, considering the gravity of the situation. The stranger's words were not to be taken lightly. If what he said was true, then the wilderness, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield. And if the bears were now adapting, it meant one thing: the mountain was changing. "I've seen some strange things on this mountain too," Jonathan muttered, looking toward the dark window. Snow continued to fall in heavy swaths, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the logs as though the mountain itself was calling to him. "But I never imagined we'd have to worry about the bears becoming this smart." The man shifted, now sitting straighter, his attention drawn back to Jonathan. "You've been out here a long time, haven't you? I can see it in your eyes. You've got experience, but you're going to need more than that this winter." Jonathan met the man's gaze. He could tell by the way the stranger's voice trembled, the way his hands gripped his knees, that this was no ordinary warning. Something had shifted on this mountain, and it wasn't just the storm. "How do we prepare?" Jonathan asked, his voice calm but laced with urgency. The stranger didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked into the fire, the orange glow casting shadows across his face. "We don't just prepare," he said softly. "We fight back. We find a way to make it through the winter, or we die trying." The words hung heavy in the air, filling the room with an unspoken understanding. Jonathan knew that he had no choice but to act, to rethink everything he had known about survival in the wild. The mountain no longer held just a bounty of fur and timber. It was a test of endurance, a cruel game with the highest stakes. If he didn't adapt, there might not be enough of him left to fight. The night stretched on, and with it, Jonathan's thoughts twisted and turned in 1,000 directions. He knew the mountain well, every ridge, every stream, every shadow. But this winter, it felt different. It felt dangerous in a way he hadn't prepared for. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the snow piled up thicker against the door. Jonathan could hear the trees groaning under the pressure, their branches bending and cracking. It was the kind of night where the mountain could swallow you whole, leaving nothing but silence and memories. The stranger had fallen asleep near the fire, his face softened in exhaustion. Jonathan glanced over at him, then back to the storm outside. He knew there was little point in waiting. The bears had already shown their hand. They were smarter than they used to be, and if they came for this cabin, he needed to be ready. He rose quietly from his seat, moving toward the shelves that lined the walls. His hands moved with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years working with wood and iron, who understood the weight of every tool in his cabin. He pulled out his rifle and examined it by the flickering firelight. The weapon was old, but reliable. His thoughts drifted back to the design of the cabin, how he had taken extra care to build it strong, to reinforce the doors and windows. He had learned from the mistakes of others, the whispers of men who had lost everything to the wilderness. He had fortified his home with thick beams, reinforced the door with iron hinges, and sealed the cracks in the walls with a sturdy resin mix. But even the best-laid plans could fail. Jonathan paused for a moment, letting the weight of his decision settle over him. There was no more time for preparation. He needed to act now. A loud bang suddenly echoed through the cabin, jolting him out of his thoughts. The noise came from outside, the unmistakable sound of something large, something heavy, colliding with the cabin walls. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't ready, but the mountain didn't care. The stranger stirred, waking up with a start. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice raspy with sleep. Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he moved quickly to the window, peering through the crack between the logs. There, just beyond the dim light of the fire, he saw massive tracks, distorted and clawed, marking the snow. "They're here," Jonathan muttered under his breath. The first test had come, and it was far worse than he could have imagined. Without hesitation, Jonathan grabbed his rifle and moved toward the door. The storm outside had begun to rage harder, but it no longer mattered. His only focus was on the threat outside and the one that was now closing in. The mountain was not done with him yet. The wind howled as Jonathan stepped silently toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The storm outside was no longer just a threat of cold, it was the perfect cover for whatever was lurking just beyond the cabin's walls. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The sound of the wind was momentarily interrupted by another thundering noise. This time, it came from the door. Something was pressing against it. Jonathan's hand tightened. Around the rifle, the wood smooth and familiar beneath his fingers. He had spent years in the wilderness, but this was different. The mountain wasn't just testing his survival instincts, it was attacking him with intent. The bears were not merely animals driven by hunger. They were becoming predators of opportunity, exploiting the weaknesses of human creation. He glanced back at the stranger, who had stirred awake, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. The man had lived in the wilderness before, but there was no mistaking it, this was something even he hadn't encountered. "They're here," Jonathan whispered, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "Stay behind me, and whatever you do, don't make a sound." The stranger nodded quickly, backing away as Jonathan positioned himself at the door, his rifle aimed at the threshold. He could hear the bear's heavy breathing, the scraping of claws against the wooden beams. The beast was testing the door, pushing its weight against the thick planks as if it could sense the smallest of weaknesses. A low growl rumbled from the other side, and Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. The cabin had stood firm so far, but there was no guarantee it would hold much longer. Every instinct in him screamed to flee, to run out into the storm and take his chances in the open air, but he couldn't abandon his home. This was his refuge, his sanctuary. The bears had to be stopped here. Suddenly, with a deafening crash, the door splintered, and the massive shape of a grizzly bear lunged forward. Jonathan fired. The blast of the rifle split the air like thunder, but the bear's momentum wasn't halted. The bullet hit the creature square in the shoulder, but it barely seemed to slow the massive beast. The bear roared in pain and fury, raking its claws across the doorframe as it pushed forward, breaking through what was left of the door. Jonathan ducked just in time to avoid a swipe that would have shredded him. He fired again, but the bear was too fast, too relentless. It pushed its way into the cabin, its enormous body filling the doorway as the stranger screamed in terror. The bear lunged again, its eyes locked onto Jonathan, its teeth bared in a terrifying snarl. Jonathan moved with precision, sidestepping to the right just as the bear crashed into the cabin's interior. The force of the collision sent splinters of wood flying, but Jonathan wasn't distracted. He raised his rifle one last time. In the chaos of the storm and the smoke from the fire, the mountain seemed to shrink around him. There was no escape now, only the fight for survival. With a final resounding shot, the rifle cracked through the air again, and this time the bear let out a horrified, pained bellow before collapsing to the floor. The battle was over. Jonathan stood there, his rifle smoking, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounded in his chest, but he was alive. The beast, a testament to the mountain's fury, lay dead in the center of his cabin. The stranger was still crouching by the fire, his face pale and his hands trembling. You killed it," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Jonathan nodded grimly. "We're not safe yet." The storm outside raged on, a furious reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded inside the cabin. The bear lay lifeless in the center of the room, its massive body a grim monument to the violence that the wilderness could unleash. Jonathan could feel the weight of the battle settling over him, but there was no time for rest. The danger wasn't over. It never was. Jonathan surveyed the damage to the cabin. The door was gone, shattered into pieces by the bear's assault. The wall where the beast had breached the structure was marked with deep claw marks, and the floor was scattered with the debris of broken wood. His once safe refuge now felt like a tomb, a hollow reminder of how quickly the wilderness could turn against a man. He turned toward the stranger, who was still seated by the fire, his eyes wide, as though he hadn't quite registered the gravity of what had just happened. The man had seen danger in the mountains before, but this was different. He had witnessed firsthand what happened when the wilderness didn't just test a man's strength, but his very will to survive. "You can't stay here," Jonathan said, his voice firm. The words had the weight of an ultimatum. The stranger blinked, as though coming back to the present, his face drawn with fear. "What? Where else would we go?" the man replied, his voice trembling. "The storm's not over, but we can't stay here," Jonathan said, moving to grab a pack of supplies from the shelf. "If one bear got through, others will follow. They've tasted human flesh now." The stranger stood up slowly, looking at the wreckage around him. His face was a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You're saying we're going to leave? Out there, in that storm?" His voice shook, his eyes scanning the harsh whiteness visible through the cabin window. "Yes," Jonathan replied firmly. "We'll head west, toward the ridge. There's a trading post a few days' journey from here. We'll make it before the next storm hits." Jonathan moved quickly, gathering the essentials: rifles, dried meat, fire-starting tools, and blankets. He worked with methodical precision, the quiet intensity of a man used to the weight of responsibility. His mind raced, the cold calculation of survival taking over. Every move had to be precise. One mistake in these mountains could mean death. The stranger, though reluctant, began to help, though his movements were stiff, unsure. The reality of the situation was dawning on him. This wasn't just about fighting the storm, it was about surviving an enemy that didn't play by the same rules. Jonathan shoved the door open, the wind immediately rushing in, biting through his thick coat. He stepped into the snowdrift outside, the weight of the storm settling over him like a blanket. The mountain was silent now, but Jonathan knew better than to think it was done with them. "Stay close," Jonathan called to the stranger, his voice lost in the howling wind. They would need all their strength to survive what lay ahead. The mountain had already claimed so much now, it was time to see if they could outlast it. The storm tore through the mountain pass, a wall of snow and ice that made every step a struggle. Jonathan and the stranger trudged through the knee-deep snow, their breath visible in the freezing air. The world around them was swallowed in white, no horizon, no landmarks, just the endless stretch of snow and the relentless wind. It was as if the mountain itself had erased everything but the cold. Jonathan's mind was sharp despite the biting wind. Every few steps he scanned their surroundings, checking the trail behind them. The bears were no longer his only concern. The weather, the terrain, and the isolation were just as dangerous. He knew the wilderness well, but it was rare for the snow to hit this hard, this early. His body ached with the cold, but he pushed on, his instincts screaming that they couldn't afford to stop. The stranger, once full of fear and uncertainty, had fallen into a rhythm behind Jonathan, but his pace was slower. His boots were ill-suited for the snow, and his clothes weren't as heavy as Jonathan's. Jonathan glanced over his shoulder, seeing the man's strained face as he fought against the storm. "Stay close," Jonathan called out over the wind. "We're heading for higher ground. The trading post is just beyond the ridge. Once we get there, we'll be safe." The stranger nodded weakly, but it was clear he was struggling. His face was flushed with exhaustion, his movements heavy and stiff. The snow kept falling in blinding sheets, and every few minutes the wind would whip it into their faces, making it harder to see. The air itself seemed to press in on them, as though the mountain wanted to push them back. Jonathan knew that they had to make it to the ridge, where there would be shelter, perhaps an old abandoned cabin or a natural rock formation that could offer some protection from the elements. He had to keep the stranger moving. Stopping in this kind of storm meant certain death. He pushed ahead, taking longer strides to cover more ground. The wind howled around him, but he focused, blocking out the noise, focusing only on the steps ahead. With every movement, he could feel the weight of the wilderness pressing down on him. The mountains were harsh, unforgiving, like a beast waiting for them to make one mistake. And then, as they crested a small rise, Jonathan saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, was a shadow. It was larger than the usual rocks he had seen scattered on the ridge. His heart gave a brief leap. It was a structure, something that could provide them with the shelter they so desperately needed. "Over there!" Jonathan shouted, pointing to the shape through the storm. "Come on!" The stranger's face lit up with a brief flash of hope, but it quickly faded as the wind picked up again. They were almost there, but the last stretch would be the hardest. Jonathan could feel the snow piling up around his legs, and the cold gnawed at his bones. His mind raced through survival instincts. This wasn't just about reaching safety anymore. They had to survive the last few hundred yards of the storm. The stranger stumbled behind him, but Jonathan couldn't afford to wait. He forged ahead, his rifle slung across his back, the shelter ahead in his sights. If the storm let up, they'd have a chance. If not, they'd be stuck in the wilderness with no shelter, no food, and no fire. His breath turned into visible clouds, and his feet felt numb from the cold. Finally, they reached the structure, an old rock formation that had been hollowed out over time, offering a bit of protection from the storm. Jonathan quickly ducked inside, pulling the stranger along with him. The wind roared outside, but here at least they had a moment of respite. Jonathan collapsed against the wall, his body trembling with the effort of fighting the storm. The stranger collapsed beside him, panting for air. "We made it!" Jonathan said, his voice hoarse. For the first time in hours, they both allowed themselves a moment of rest. But Jonathan knew it wouldn't last. The storm was still howling outside, and the bears were still out there. The storm raged on through the night, and the cold seeped into Jonathan's bones, settling deep in his chest. The rock shelter provided little warmth, but it was enough to stop the worst of the wind. The snow piled up in front of the opening like a barrier, isolating them from the mountain and its dangers. Inside, there was only the dim glow of the fire they had managed to start in a small stone pit. Its warmth was a fleeting comfort, and it was all they had. Jonathan sat with his back to the rock wall, his rifle still cradled in his lap. He stared into the fire, the flickering light dancing across his face, but his thoughts were far from the warmth of the flames. The bear attack was still fresh in his mind. The blood, the sound of claws scraping against wood, it all played back in his head like a broken record. He shifted uncomfortably, his body sore from the cold and exhaustion. The stranger sat across from him, his face gaunt and drawn from the stress of the storm and the attack. He was staring into the fire too, but his eyes were unfocused, lost in thought. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The wind outside was constant, an ever-present reminder of the wilderness that surrounded them. But Jonathan's thoughts kept returning to the bear, and to the strange, uneasy feeling that something else was out there, watching them. The stranger finally broke the silence, his voice low and tired. "What now?" he asked, his eyes meeting Jonathan's. Jonathan looked up slowly, his gaze hardening. "Now we wait. The storm's not over yet. We'll stay here until it passes, then head for the post. And the bears?" The stranger's voice was tight with fear. "We keep moving," Jonathan said firmly. "We can't stop now." He shifted his position, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the shelter. The mountain was quiet now, but Jonathan knew it wouldn't stay that way. It never did. The bears were still out there, hunting, learning, adapting. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt something deeper than the cold. That gnawing sense of dread that came from knowing the wilderness didn't just challenge men to survive, it waited for them to fail. The night passed slowly, with the storm still howling outside, and the weight of silence hanging between them. Every rustle of the wind outside made Jonathan's muscles tense. He kept his rifle close, his eyes alert, but deep down, he knew that the real battle wasn't just against the storm, it was against the wilderness itself. They were safe for now, but Jonathan knew the mountain wouldn't give up that easily. Morning arrived with the storm still swirling around them, but the worst of the snow had passed. Jonathan stood up from the cold rock floor, stiff from hours of sitting in the confined shelter. The fire had burned low, leaving only smoldering embers, but the first weak rays of dawn pierced through the clouds. He could see the snowdrifts piled high outside the shelter, but beyond them, the outline of the ridge ahead was visible. "Time to go," Jonathan said, his voice rough but resolute. The stranger had already gathered his gear, his face still weary but relieved that the storm was finally breaking. Jonathan strapped his rifle back onto his back and slung his pack over his shoulder. He gave the stranger a nod, and the two of them stepped out into the bitter morning air. The cold nipped at their faces, but the storm had lost its fury. The ridge loomed ahead, offering the final stretch toward safety. As they moved forward, Jonathan kept his eyes scanning the landscape, his instincts never at ease in the wild. The silence around them was heavy, almost unnatural after the storm's howl. They pushed through the deep snow, their legs aching with each step. The ground underfoot was firm now, frozen and solid from the storm. Jonathan's thoughts returned to the bears. The danger wasn't over. They had to reach the trading post before nightfall. The mountain had shown its teeth, but they were alive. The mountain would not be kind forever, and they had to outlast it. By midday, the ridge was just ahead. Jonathan felt the first stirrings of hope, but he knew better than to trust it. There would be no rest until they were safe. They moved forward, every step a battle against the elements and the unforgiving wilderness. The trading post finally came into view just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. It wasn't much, a few weathered cabins, a smokehouse, and a barn, all nestled at the base of the ridge. The storm had passed, but the remnants of it still clung to the landscape in the form of ice-coated trees and frozen ground. Jonathan and the stranger walked the last stretch in silence, their legs burning with exhaustion. Their clothes were soaked from the storm, their faces raw from the biting wind. But they pushed forward. The trading post was a sign of life, a place where they could finally rest and recover, where the mountain's oppressive weight could be lifted, if only for a moment. As they approached, a figure emerged from one of the cabins, an old trapper, his face grizzled and weathered, but his eyes still sharp. He greeted them with a nod, sizing them up as they approached. "Storm was a hard one, eh?" the trapper said, his voice gruff but welcoming. Jonathan nodded, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion. "You could say that." The trapper led them inside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jonathan allowed himself to relax. The warmth of the cabin was a welcome relief, and the smell of cooking food made his stomach growl. The stranger slumped into a chair by the fire, his eyes closing in relief. Jonathan stood by the door, taking one last glance outside, the wilderness now far behind them. The mountain had taken its toll, but they had made it through. For now, that was enough. As Jonathan sat down, the trapper poured him a drink, and for the first time in days he allowed himself a moment of peace. The journey was over, but the mountain's lessons would stay with him forever.